Hello and welcome to the April UN Info Session. I'm Alex, an intern with the San Diego chapter of the United Nations Association. The San Diego chapter was founded in 1946 to promote local engagement with the United Nations, and it's one of the oldest and most active chapters within the United States. I'm joined today by Carole Landale and Ron Marcus, a speaker for and president of the organization San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention. Today we'll be discussing how the COVID-19 pandemic is shaping America's pre-existing gun violence epidemic and how gun violence shapes communities and what we can do to help solve the issue. So Carole and Ron, can you please share a bit about your background and who you are?
Sure. So I'm Carole Landale, and board member of San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention and president of Brady United Against Gun Violence. And so I got into this right after Sandy Hook in 2012 when I just retired from teaching. And I was pretty horrified by what happened at Sandy Hook and looking for something that I needed to do during my retirement years. Gun violence prevention kind of came along. I went to a vigil right after Sandy Hook and was so touched by that. So it just started from there, and that's ago, and it's got busier and busier, and the more I'm in this, the more I see how the problem of gun violence overlaps with so many things, including all of the sustainable development goals that the United Nations has. Gun violence, I know you, Alex, will be talking about that later, but really there's a lot of overlap, and so I'm really honored to be here today and to be a partner with United Nations Association of San Diego.
Sorry, Ron, your mic is...
I did it again. All right, my story is more or less the same as Carole's. Right after Sandy Hook, I was galvanized to action, and I came to that very same meeting of concerned San Diegans who wanted to do something. I joined Brady Campaign local chapter, and I will mention that a couple of years ago, members from local chapter of Brady and members from local chapter of Moms Demand Action, as well as some other concerned citizens, decided that we should all be under one umbrella instead of organizations doing the same work but separately. And so we formed this coalition, San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention. It's a 501c4 nonprofit, and under that umbrella we have many more people working in concert now doing the work that we do.
Would you mind elaborating a little bit on the work of San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention?
Sure. Ron, you will do that.
Okay. So we're essentially an education and advocacy group. We're also a support group. So on the education piece, we are routinely publishing and also visiting schools and visiting organizations and giving talks, primarily on the statistics that show the dangers of the proliferation of guns in this country, as well as programs for teaching about safe storage. So we want those that do have guns to store them carefully in their homes so that neither they nor their children or anyone that they care about could accidentally get injured by the guns in the home. And that happens all too frequently. Guns are not properly secured. So we do that piece. We advocate on a regular basis. We reach out to our local, regional, state, and national government representatives to encourage them to support common sense gun violence prevention legislation. And we're consistently either visiting them in DC or Sacramento or locally in San Diego. We're doing postcard campaigns, we're doing email campaigns. We do participate in activities where we evaluate candidates for different campaigns, and we identify those that meet criteria for being gun sense champions, if you will. And then we are a support too for the communities in San Diego that are touched by gun violence, by survivors, or by just for people that are concerned citizens that are concerned about the rate of gun violence in this country and want to do something about it. So in all those ways and more, and Carole, if you want to add to that, but that is essentially what our mission is. And I will say one more thing about this, that while this can be a very polarizing issue or described as a polarizing issue where you have those on one side that are staunch Second Amendment rights protectors, and those on the other side who are wanting to take everyone's guns away. What we represent is actually, we acknowledge everybody's constitutional rights. We acknowledge everybody's right to own a gun and to own it responsibly. And we represent, I would say, at least 90% of Americans who want to see basic common sense gun legislation at a federal level to protect all of us in all states. And this is something that both gun owners and non-gun owners absolutely agree on. So we're not in the polarized ends at all. We're right in the middle, covering almost all Americans, and that's what we represent.
So many involvements, thank you. And would you mind elaborating then on how gun sales are being impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, so gun sales in this last month have doubled. And we have statistics from the background check system, the NICS, National Criminal Instant Background Check System. They've processed 2 million background checks during March. That's double what it was for last March. So the good thing is the background check system exists, and new gun owners are being processed. But we're concerned about the number of new guns out in the community. And with this panic buying that has happened, our concern is that we've got too many new gun owners who aren't very familiar with a weapon. They don't know how to fire it. They haven't had training. And all of a sudden they're cooped up at home with their families. There's such a danger right now for the misuse of a firearm, because if you're stuck at home, we've got all the children at home, and if a gun is not properly stored, and a child finds it, and bad things can happen. So we're concerned about safe storage when it comes to children. Same thing with suicides, because right now with people being anxious and depressed, the rate of suicide is likely to go up. And then finally, our concern is with domestic violence, because again, we've got 2 people cooped up at home, and we know from statistics that if an abuser has access to a gun, that the abused person is 5 times more likely to die from that gun. So it's like one healthcare problem on top of another, and I think we've got a collision of health problems. And all of this is stoked so much by the fear factor. And unfortunately, the NRA has kind of cashed in on the fear factor and have been encouraging people to buy guns just to boost gun sales. And that fear comes from people who are being led to believe that, okay, society is falling to pieces around us, and who knows, I'm going to need a firearm to protect myself and my family. They're fearful that the police are either going to be sick or from COVID, or they're going to be unable to answer a 911 call fast enough. So another reason why a person might need a gun. And also that there's been a lot of prisoners who have been released because of the COVID problem in prison. So a lot of non-violent offenders are now out. And so again, we've got this fear factor being fed to the public, that you need to have your gun to protect yourself from all of these things. The unfortunate thing is that these panic buyers are really not aware that a gun in the home is not going to make them safer. Obviously, it's not going to do anything to protect them from COVID, but the statistics show that a gun in the home is 3 times more likely to be used against the homeowner or the inhabitants of the home. And this is from a study from David Hemingway, a Harvard researcher, and a gun is only 1% likely to be successful in fighting a home invasion. So it's like the statistics are showing that more guns out there lead to more danger. And so the fear factor with COVID the health crisis caused by COVID. We've already got a health crisis with guns. It's kind of a bad combination.
Terrible, yeah. And I recently read that gun industry lobbyists push to be included in the federal advisory for essential businesses, which is part of what's increasing the rates of sales right now. So a more general question is, what role does the gun industry play in the gun violence crisis, and how is the industry either held accountable or immune to scrutiny?
Yeah. Well, I think I've already touched on the fact that the gun industry is using the fear factor to push the sales of guns, and the NRA as the spokesperson, the spokes organization for the gun industry, is doing quite a good job of that. So how is the gun industry held accountable? Not very well, actually. And there are a couple of things that come to mind. In 2003, there was something called the Tayart Amendment that actually forbid the ATF, which is responsible for keeping track of gun sales. The ATF has been forbidden to release trace data to anyone except for law enforcement. So that means if a firearm is found on a crime scene, okay, the city can't learn about it, news reporters can't learn about it, anyone wanting to research can't learn about it. And so that's very unhelpful. So obviously, and what's more, the evidence cannot be used in a court of law. So it's not a helpful amendment. And another one that comes to mind is the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, and this was from 2005. And this one basically protects gun dealers and gun manufacturers from any kind of a lawsuit, unlike any other industry in the country. So immune from lawsuits. So as far as are they being held accountable? I would say not so much. And if Ron has something to say that they are, please add it in here.
Well, just typically gun manufacturers, ammunition manufacturers, resellers, gun dealers, the enforcement is relatively lax, and there have been laws passed because of the outside influence of the gun lobby that make it very hard to share data. In 1996, the Dickey Amendment was attached to a bill that essentially muzzled the Centers for Disease Control by saying that they could not be perceived to be advocating for gun control. And that's a really gray area in terms of how do you define perceived as advocating. And so basically any research that they could have done and published might be seen as advocating for gun violence prevention. So they had, even though they weren't technically prohibited from doing gun violence research, they stopped spending money on it for fear that they would be perceived as advocating for gun violence prevention. And so for 20 years, they were completely muzzled. It was only in the past year that we actually saw, what was it, $20 million, Carole? Or
yeah, I think
that was, right. Or 20 or 25, one of those numbers. But that was actually approved to allow the CDC to resume that research. It's amazing that took so long to finally pass again. So as Carole said, the gun industry is not really being taken into account. More often than not, people that choose to sue the gun industry after they've been in a terrible tragedy end up losing or getting dragged through the mud in court for years. And we know people firsthand that have been bankrupted just because of that kind of thing. So it's not a pretty picture from that standpoint.
No, that's horrible. That's 2 tragedies in a row. So my next question is, what rights are secured by the original Second Amendment? You've spoken a lot about amendments to this amendment, so I'm curious about that. And then how are gun safety laws compatible with those rights secured by the Second Amendment?
Okay, do you want me to take this one, Ron?
Sure.
Okay, so just a quick review then of the Second Amendment, right? A well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So what we need to remember is that this was written in 1789, and it was written specifically because the new country at that time did not have an army, and so there needed to be a militia in case that there was the Brits, my countrymen, wanted to take the country back. So, you know, we're looking now, I don't believe that Madison was actually the one who was the original author, but I don't believe that the founders could have had any idea what was going to be happening with guns between 1789 and 2020. I mean, they didn't know that we were going to be getting into semi-automatics and as assault weapons. So it was written at a time when we didn't have the technology that we have today. And what's happened since, probably in the court case that has most influenced the Second Amendment is the Heller decision. And this was in 2008. And that sort of disconnected the idea of the militia with right to bear arms. And it basically said that every American has the right to carry a gun to have a gun in his home for lawful purposes and self-defense. The one thing that did come out of that is positive, it also said that the right to own a gun is not unlimited, and gun ownership will continue to be regulated. So we kind of look at that now as, okay, yes, gun ownership can be regulated and must be regulated. And so this is why we do advocate for sensible gun legislation. And some of the things, I mean, the most obvious one, Ron touched on it earlier, the background check law. And you know, we have a background check law. Well, it's like a no-brainer to most people, 90% of the American public. And the only thing is, the background check law that we have right now was written in 1993, and that was before internet sales, and it also excluded gun shows. So, you know, some of the basic things that we're asking for at the federal level would be a reinstatement, a rewriting of the background check law. And in fact, that has happened, and it did pass the House, but it's got stuck in the Senate, and unfortunately, that's probably where it's going to stay. So that is a basic law that is completely compatible with gun rights. We're not taking anyone's guns away. We're just asking that if you're going to have a firearm, that you go through a background check and that you're not a criminal and you're not mentally unstable. So, you know, I think some other things, the ERPOs, the Extreme Risk Protection Order, is another one. California has one. It's the California equivalent is a gun violence restraining order, which allows guns to be temporarily removed from a person who is threatening to do harm to himself or to others. And we're not taking anyone's guns away other than on a temporary basis for a person who is in crisis. This is not infringing on a Second Amendment right. And I think most of us agree that assault weapons are probably not necessary, especially assault weapons with more than 10 rounds of ammunition. Again, California limits the number of rounds of ammunition to 10. And it seems pretty sensible to me. I don't know why we need an assault weapon beyond 10 rounds. You still got your gun.
Yeah,
it's not a musket like it was in 1789.
I'm just going to add very quickly that there's two ways to interpret the Second Amendment, two polarized ends of the spectrum, where it's either a full blanket protection to own and use a gun as you see fit, to something that can be highly regulated. And so there's kind of a shift. It's kind of a slippery slope. Where can we fall on the constitutional scale to where we can say we're protecting Second Amendment rights, but still adequately regulating guns so that people can stay safe? And parties on both sides will test that on a regular basis and see how much they can steer the interpretation of the law one side or the other. And it's to the point that any proposition of any kind of law, any proposal of any kind of law that might increase regulation of gun use is portrayed as an attack on the Second Amendment and against the Constitution, and that's the rallying cry. So that is the challenge that we face on a regular basis to try to get anything passed.
Right.
Yeah, so gun regulations are very contentious in our American political system. And how big is the issue of gun violence in America in general, and what threats exist beyond the mass shootings that we hear about all the time in the media?
Ron?
Well, in the hour that it will take to do this recording, 4 Americans will have been shot and killed in this country, either as a suicide or a homicide. And that's constant. That's 24/7. So an average of 104 people a day are shot and killed in this country. And that adds up to roughly 40,000 gun deaths per year. To put that in perspective, we're now at about 30,000 automobile-related deaths per year. And that's a number that is far, far, far lower than what it used to be before we had the raft of regulations that we have on owning and operating a vehicle. So it stands to reason that when you pass sensible regulations on something that is a potentially very dangerous tool or piece of equipment, you see deaths go down as a result. And so I think that we can look at gun ownership and use and regulation as very similar to car ownership and use and regulation. But we're looking at we're in the middle of a pandemic right now as we record this, and we're looking at numbers of deaths that are in the tens of thousands, and we're horrified by this, and rightly so. And yet we have a crisis of the same proportion in gun deaths every year. And yet we fight tooth and nail as a country against regulations that could help reduce that. And that's what we as an organization are trying to change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. So what are the impacts on communities? Like, how are communities impacted by gun violence?
Okay,
Go ahead, Carole.
Okay, so obviously a community that's been affected by gun violence is going to be traumatized. And I'm thinking of the families at Sandy Hook Elementary School, and they are still traumatized, and they will be for the rest of their lives. The same thing with Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Those students are still in PTSD and probably will be, and having to go to therapy for many years. So gun violence is obviously going to be harmful to a community. And I think the other thing that happens in communities, especially communities of color, is that because of the fear, and they're living with gun violence on a daily basis, and there are gunshots going off, every time they walk out their house, they're hearing gunshots. And so then they are going to be encouraged to buy a gun to protect themselves. Well, yeah, it makes sense that I'm going to need a gun. So it becomes a kind of a vicious cycle of more gun violence. I need a gun to protect myself from this gun. And so that's very unhelpful. And there's this proliferation of guns that especially goes into communities of color. So looking at some of the good things that have come out from communities changed by gun violence, and I'm going back again to Sandy Hook, and a couple of organizations that are still really active in the gun violence prevention movement. The Newtown Action Alliance that advocates for safe, sensible gun laws is one of them. And Sandy schools and brings programs to schools is another. And so both those programs are really working at the grassroots level with children in one instance, and with legislation at the other. Out of the Parkland shooting came the March for Our Lives movement with the students, and they have become huge activists for gun violence prevention. So communities are changed. They're changed in good and bad ways, the trauma, and then what the action that they have to take afterwards to change the situation.
Thank you. Those are excellent examples. And so you touched on a few different ways that California in particular works to reduce gun violence, including the California Gun Violence Restraining Order and the fact that citizens are limited to 10 rounds of ammunition. But I'm wondering in what other ways California's gun laws differ from those in the rest of the nation, and how that difference in policy can translate to a big difference between life and death for certain communities and individuals.
Okay, Ron?
Well, California leads the nation in terms of gun laws. We have stricter gun regulations, more gun regulations than any other state. We most recently put a limit on the amount of ammunition you can purchase in a 30-day period, as well as a limit on the types of guns that you can buy per month. We also have to have background checks now on ammunition purchases in California. So those are just the latest in terms of the laws that we are passing and continue to pass in California. And as populous a state as we are 8th in the nation in terms of deaths per capita. So we're among the best. The data will show that over time, as we have passed these laws, there's been a positive correlation, or I should say there's been an inverse correlation with the number of gun deaths. So it is showing to be working. And in fact, that bears out across the United States. Places that have fewer guns and more regulations have fewer deaths per capita in gun deaths. And the inverse is true as well. And the longer you tabulate this data, the more that bears out. So in terms of correlation, it's strong. We still need more research to show absolute causation in different areas, but the correlation is very strong, and then anecdotally, it's reliable. So California is a safer place to be because of the laws that we're passing, and will continue to get safer and safer. Where we still have a gap, though, is because we don't have universal laws across the country. It means that guns that would be illegal to purchase in our state for any number of reasons can be purchased across state lines and brought back here. And there's also all kinds of illegal crime guns that flow in because of that. So until we have a more coordinated response that's nationwide, we're going to continue to have holes. And we'll keep trying to pass laws to keep us all here as safe as possible, but that's the challenge still.
Those are excellent points. Thank you. And now I'm wondering about San Diego in particular, if there is any San Diego specific legislation and how gun violence looks within San Diego County.
Okay, so San Diego actually, compared with other cities this size, has really low gun violence. So we're very fortunate in that way. But it still happens. And it largely happens in socioeconomic areas that are low socioeconomic areas and communities of color. And it's largely related to gangs. Two things have happened recently that have really improved the ability of San Diego law enforcement to cut down on stolen guns and guns used in unintentional shootings. First of all, the GVROs, which I really talked about earlier, that has been enforced by our city attorney, Mara Elliott. She has done an amazing job with making sure law enforcement is trained in how gun violence restraining orders work. And she has also trained a lot of police departments across the state. So that's been one thing from San Diego. But the other thing that just happened last year, and that is the safe storage ordinance that with the help again of Mara Elliott's office and a lot of support from San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention, the city of San Diego passed, and that requires guns to be locked up unless they're in the immediate possession of their lawful owner. So that one, I believe, is going to be a really excellent law for cutting down on stolen guns and unintentional shootings, and hopefully, and maybe suicides as well. So I think San Diego is actually doing a very good job in the gun violence prevention area.
That's good to hear. Now I'm wondering, so it's great that San Diego's doing a good job, but as you mentioned, Ron, our nation could be doing a better job. And so what can we learn from nations abroad who are successful in reducing gun violence?
Well, one can look to Britain, uh, to England, to Scotland, to Australia, to New Zealand, all of which had suffered a mass shooting tragedy, not a string of tragedies, not years worth of tragedies, but a tragedy which got their governments to quickly be able to pass laws that basically prohibited all but a few people from being able to walk around with guns. And that has all but eliminated gun deaths in these countries. The important thing to know, and we may be able to touch again later on this when we talk about what we can do as citizens, is that these countries are parliamentary governments. And as such, the president has a lot of power and is not necessarily restricted in terms of getting laws passed the way we are with a bipartisan system and a House and a Senate and a president. So their system is designed in such a way that those that are in power can get things passed a lot more quickly and easily. And that's why they were able to do that. I also want to point out Japan, which of course used to be a very warlike culture until after World War II, when they basically banned military and they banned guns, period. And so you can own a gun in Japan, but you have to jump through all kinds of regulatory hoops and licensing, and you have to get retested and relicensed every year. So essentially, people that want to shoot guns in Japan will go on vacation in Hawaii to be able to go to firing ranges and do that. And the number of gun deaths per capita in Japan is effectively zero. So if you want some inspiration, there it is. You have other countries like Israel and Switzerland where gun ownership rates are very high. But the culture there is completely different. They don't have a Second Amendment. They don't have a Wild West culture. They respect what a gun can do, and guns are literally there. It's almost harkening back to the original reason the Second Amendment was written. Folks their own guns in case they are called up to military service, but they don't own guns for their self-protection or for hunting or for and they just don't have the cultural attachment to firearms that we do in this country. So it's just a very different attitude towards guns.
What ways do you see that we could shift our attitude?
I think that's one of the things that we are trying to do through education. And so until people are aware of the problem, there's not going to be a lot of change. But I think our first job is to bring awareness to the problem. When we state the statistics that Ron just said, we've got 40,000 deaths a year in this country from guns. And so often when I've said that, use that statistic, people practically fall off their chairs. They don't know. So I think that's number one in building awareness. And then I'm looking for, I don't know, what do we do next? Once we've got the awareness, people need to step up and start saying, okay, this is not an acceptable way for our country, and to do something with the laws. And that is one of the things that we've been trying to do. And changing is a hard one.
I will add to that because in order to change the laws and in order to change culture, ultimately we need to change the people that are in government that are making the laws. And right now, the government is controlled by a majority that would rather preserve the status quo. And so it's been very hard to change this, from a cultural standpoint. I believe that, like many things, if you look at just the societal changes that we've brought about in this country since the beginning of the 20th century, from women's suffrage to civil rights to LGBTQ rights and right to marry, we have a long ways to go. I'm not saying that we're perfect society by any means, but we've made great strides. And also things like car safety and big tobacco. And so over time, and it may take a generation or two. And we're quite emboldened by the young generation, particularly after Parkland, that has stepped up. And it may be in their hands, by the time we're actually able to shift the makeup of the government to be able to pass some of these laws. And once those laws are passed and people get used to them and they realize that it isn't an overreach at all, it's helping save lives, they'll get used to it. And pretty soon they'll wonder, it'll be in the history books that people argued about this stuff, but they'll be wondering what all the big deal was, right? Just like car ownership is right now. So
I think tobacco is the other one that comes to mind, that, look, everybody used to smoke, and that changed. So that's, and that also came from the younger generation. I know I grew up with parents who smoked. I never smoked, but it was my generation that changed that. And I think, as Ron says, we're very heartened by the youth of today who they're in the front lines, they're in schools, and their schools are being shut up. So, changing slowly, bit by bit.
Yeah, those are powerful analogies. Thank you. And I'm wondering now, so shifting a cultural perspective on guns is very important. And you mentioned some other solutions. And so I'm inquiring into one of the solutions, which is background checks, and what difference do background checks make?
Okay, well, I'll start on that one. So since the original background check law went into place in 1993, that was the Brady background check law, named after Jim Brady, who was Reagan's press secretary. So that has since that date, it's prohibited 3 million criminals from purchasing guns. So I don't know what that amounts to per year or per day or anything like that, but 3 million is a lot of purchases that would otherwise have bought guns, and those guns will be out on the street in the hands of people who shouldn't have them. So I think that that alone is very helpful. It's not enough, but having that background check system definitely does prevent a lot of guns from getting into the hands of the wrong people. What it doesn't do, and I think I touched on this earlier, it doesn't cover gun shows, and it doesn't cover online sales. So those are some loopholes that need to be fixed, on the background checks.
What are permit to purchase laws?
So a permit to purchase, and there are only like 15 states that have this permit to purchase. And what that does is it adds another layer of security to the federal background check system. So most states, that California included, that have this permit or license, and in California, actually, it's the safety certificate. Those have to be obtained through law enforcement. So you actually have to go to your law enforcement office and say, this is what I want. In the case of California, where it's not a permit to purchase, but you have to have your safety certificate, you have to get that from a licensed gun owner, a licensed gun dealer. So these are just extra steps on top of the background check. And in California, the background check system is more, covers more, it covers gun shows and it covers private sales, unlike the federal one. So many states have filled in some of those loopholes at the federal level. Permit to purchase and the safety certificate are just one more level of making sure that guns are in the hands of people who know what they're doing with them.
And so you mentioned a couple of the loopholes earlier, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what the problem of ghost guns is.
Do you want to do that, Ron, or should I go with ghost guns?
Whatever your preference is, Carole. I know we both could talk about it.
Okay, well, I'll start. You fill in. So, because I did go just recently to with somebody to a gun show to buy a ghost gun, and it was so easy. So first of all, what's the definition of a ghost gun? It could be it's a do-it-yourself homemade gun, which you can put together in several minutes. And it does not have on it a serial number. Now, a responsible gun owner will go to in California, will go to the California Department of Justice, apply for a serial number, and have that serial number on his homemade gun. Well, is a criminal going to do that? So they are increasing alarm about ghost guns amongst law enforcement and amongst legislators. So there is a bill right now, a law that is going to regulate the precursor parts, the bits that you put together to make a gun, to make sure that they do have a serial number so that that gun could be traced. However, that law is not going to go into effect until 2024. And in the meantime, there are lots of kits out there with no serial numbers. And I saw one maker at one of the talks that I was at, and he showed me a piece of metal that he'd got from Home Depot and fashioned it into a lower receiver. And he said, yeah, you can make this from bits and pieces that I picked up at Home Depot. So it's a little bit alarming. Now, it also includes, ghost guns also include 3D printed. But I think the most alarming is the fact that these kits are being sold at gun shows and other places, and there is no regulation at all at the moment.
So to round out that answer, they're trying to make it so that the definition of what a gun is more complete. So essentially, if you say, okay, well, if it has this percentage of finished parts, it's a gun, then they just start selling kits with one less part, and then it's still not a gun, according to that. So they're really clever about that. And the biggest problem with ghost guns is that when a crime is committed, there's no way to trace where that gun came from. So there's no way to solve that crime. And that really has police, law enforcement worried. And we need to do something about it.
Yeah.
That is scary indeed. Something that I feel like a lot of people don't know much about. And the more I hear from the two of you, the more frightened I become.
Well, let me just give you a little bit of reassurance. So the bill that passed, that is now law, that will go into effect in 2024, there is another bill out there that hopefully after all the COVID stuff is over with, is going to speed that up, and we will have some legislation that will require the ghost gun bits and pieces to have serial numbers imprinted on them. So sooner the better.
Yeah, we don't want you to be scared. There's some really good people that work in the legislative realm and the lobbying, on the side of sensible legislation, that are working very hard in Sacramento and beyond, obviously, to get these things passed. So we're not being passive about it. But neither is the other side. So there's a lot of work going on both sides.
And some great local advocacy like the two of you as well. So don't discount your efforts. And I'm wondering if you could share some final thoughts on the most promising solutions to ending gun violence in America, and how people can get involved in the San Diegans for gun violence prevention.
Okay.
Well, I think the single most important and impactful thing that we all can do is vote in the November election. We have a big opportunity to change the makeup of, obviously, the presidency and seats in the House and Senate. And it's very, very important that we become aware that, and I know this group, I don't even have to say that, but if more people would become critical readers of news from multiple sources and get informed on what's going on and understand why complacency is causing all the issues that we have, and to sort of be able to look behind the scenes. I mean, right now, as we're all focused on COVID-19, there are other things going on in government that no one is taking notice of. For instance, the rollback of Environmental Protection Agency protections, and that's going to have huge impacts on our country, particularly as we're looking at climate change down the road. So, and the impacts of that. So we really need to be informed. We need to vote. We need to influence others. Our votes matter. We need to get more and more young people and people of all backgrounds to come to vote. I think that's the single most important thing that we all can do. And at the same time, as Carole talked about, just continuing to participate in education. SD4GVP, San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention, is the local place where you can get involved in any capacity. We have a lot of great volunteers. They all bring different talents to bear, and we can always use more help. I like to say many hands make light work, and so the more of us that are staffing events, utilizing our contacts in government, at schools, PTAs, writing op-eds, coming up with new ideas and ways of outreach, and just being present. You know, sometimes when that law that Carole was talking about, which mandates safe storage in the home, we had a lot of people show up to City Hall to make the case for that, and so did folks that were trying to push against that law. But we had a sea of, we like to joke around because our trademark T-shirt is a red shirt, so we had a sea of red shirts in that City Hall room, and it worked, and it passed. So we can and are making a difference. And the first Saturday of every month at 10 a.m. we meet. We have a group meeting. Right now it's over Zoom. So we all get back together, and then we have a newsletter that we send out a couple of times a month. And so just go to sd4gvp.org and you can get involved. Carole, you want to add anything to that?
You covered it all. Perfect.
Thank you so much. So now I'm going to go into kind of how gun violence prevention relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I know Carole in particular did some background research on that as well. So if you feel like I've missed any point, feel free to chime in there. I'm going to share screen to a kind of presentation on it. There we go. Okay. So basically an introduction to the Sustainable Development Goals. Here you can see the 17 goals that were developed as a way to, basically it's a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. These goals were agreed upon by all of the United Nations member states in 2015, and they're trying to achieve these goals by 2030. And all of the goals are interconnected and include several targets to ensure that specific aspects of the goals are addressed. And so the connection between gun violence prevention and the Sustainable Development Goals is that gun violence in America is an increasingly widespread issue, and it occurs due to many different reasons. There's no single way to address it. But it is important to acknowledge that violence is rarely committed for the sake of violence. Rather, it has its roots in many different issues. And those include poverty, weak infrastructure, injustice, desperation, all of the things that these 17 goals are attempting to address. And so there are several sustainable development goals that relate directly to violence. The first being SDG 1, which is no poverty. Carole previously mentioned that a low socioeconomic status in a society often correlates directly with increased gun violence. And in the United States, that's particularly true in areas where there is growing income inequalities. It relates almost very directly to gun violence, and poverty is caused by many different things: unemployment, social exclusion, certain populations' high vulnerability to diseases or disaster, or other phenomena that prevent productivity. And so this goal is attempting to address those original causes of poverty. Next, we have good health and well-being, SDG 3. So clearly, if you are injured from gun violence, you're not as healthy as you could be. But also, you know, gun violence can cause a lot of damage psychologically. It can cause premature death, injuries, disabilities, and impacts productivity in a myriad of different ways. And so in order to achieve good health and well-being, we must promote disarmament and arms control measures. Next, we have SDG 4 for quality education. In the news in the United States, we constantly hear stories about gun violence on school grounds. And in 2020 alone, even before the school closures about a month ago, there were already 32 incidences of gun violence on schools in America. And students exposed to violence, crime, and abuse are more likely to suffer from anxiety, depression, or PTSD related to that violence. And so, Carole, why do some people oppose emergency school lockdown procedures?
Trauma. So yes, it's important that students be aware and practice for an event where there may be a shooter on campus, but people are opposing it, and I do as well, to make these lockdown procedures so alarming and so frightening to students, possibly with even a make-believe shooter. Now, I think most schools have left that idea, but they were suggesting that, and some schools were using it. Now, there's a book called Lockdown. No, I don't have it with me. But I listened to that author talking about her book, and she related a story of a school where there was the principal had told the parents that he would inform them if there was going to be a lockdown. So therefore, if they didn't want to have their child come to school because of the trauma that it would cause, that they could keep their child at home. So this little girl did go to school one day, and she went to the bathroom, and there was a lockdown. And she knew that she would have been kept home if this was not a practice. So she knew that this was for real. And she tried to get into a classroom. And of course, the protocol is that teachers should not open their doors under any event. So this child ran door to door and finally just crumpled up in a ball in a fetal position and in tears and screaming. She was found there after the practice lockdown, and she has since refused to ever go to school again. It was so traumatizing for her. So this is the kind of thing that no other country in the world does practice lockdowns for school shooters. We don't need this in this country either. So I get a little bit angry that we even have to have them, and why so many people oppose them.
Yeah. Wow, that is quite the story. And I recently read a statistic that the school safety industry is now valued at $3 billion. So in another sense, people are profiting directly off of those fears that they're stoking in both parents and children. For example, bulletproof backpacks and yeah. Oh, tough to hear.
It is, and that's not what school's about.
Yeah. Our next SDG is SDG 5 for gender equality. We mentioned at the beginning about how with the current lockdowns, we're experiencing much higher rates of domestic abuse. And in general, gun ownership is predominantly male, and predominantly the shooters are also male. And so it's important to have gender considerations be a part of advocacy for reducing gun violence. Do you have anything to add to that as well?
I think we covered it. The fact that a woman is 5 times more likely to be shot if there's a gun present, if she's in a domestic abuse situation. Yeah. I think with some of the prejudice against the LGBTQ community, they are also at higher risk for gun violence.
Yeah. And I recently read that already 1 in 4 countries have no laws specifically protecting women from domestic violence. So globally, we need to have some shift in that sense as well. And then finally, we have SDG 16, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And all of these conditions are essential for long-term development, and in particular, Target 16.4 aims to significantly reduce all forms of violence and the flow of illicit arms by 2030 to reduce armed violence and related deaths. So it's very clear the connection between gun violence prevention and our ability to form sustainably developed societies across the world. And that's all I have.
Couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much for speaking with us and sharing all of your expertise.
Thank you for having us.
Very much. Thank you for having us. And again, very happy to be a partner with United Nations Association. Thank you.
And us with you. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.